Welcome to Institute and Faculty of Actuaries sessional meeting on why the pensions dashboard is more than a data collection exercise. My name's Andrew Lowe. I'm the chair of the Future Pensions Landscape Working Party. Unfortunately, no other members of the working party were able to attend this evening, so you're stuck with me for a good bit of it. A little bit of my background first. I'm qualified as an actuary in 2005, I think. Did a bit of a stint doing consultancy work in public and private sector. I'm now Director of Change and Data Solutions for Equinity. With me today to support, thankfully, I'm very grateful to Michael from Orago, who's their Development Director. Spent a lot of time thinking about dashboard and all things dashboard, working with various parties across the industry who are interested in getting it off the ground. So he's going to do a bit of scene setting, then I'm going to go back and cover some slides which I'm hoping might be thought-provoking. But equally, I'm sure that some of you have come prepared with some thoughts to add to the debate. It's a long time since I've been to a session like this, so I believe I'm supposed to ask if anybody does have any pre-prepared material, if they could raise their hand. We'll go with no. Okay. Thank you. That means that Michael and I can speak for as long as we want. No, not really. We will do our bit and then open the floor to debate, and hopefully we'll get some interesting conversations on the go. So yeah, on that I shall hand over to Michael to set the scene about Pensions Dashboard.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Rowe. I'm the Development Director at Orago. We are a local fintech company. We're based out in Edinburgh Park on the floodplain. There's about 70 of us, so one of our claims is we're one of the oldest fintechs in Scotland. We've been involved with the pension dashboard from the outset, from the days when Potfall's member was discontinued. We are technologists, we're not actuaries. We are industry owned. We've been involved in the various feasibility studies that have been going on for the last 4.5 years. So we're involved in one with the Money Advice Service. We're involved in the ABI prototype. We built a pension finder service for that initiative. Since then, Orago is split into two. It's worth mentioning that the standards part of Orago is now called Criterion. So they were involved in defining the data standards that would support what the dashboard would display. So Criterion are still hoping to be involved in that. We've supported the DWP. We've continued to invest in our pension finder service. We've scale tested it to 15 million citizens, and we responded to the DWP consultation alongside the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and numerous other organisations. I should say that Orago has not been appointed to do anything officially on the pension dashboard, so our aspirations are to be the pension finder service. We are an industry-owned non-for-profit organisation. We will have to go through a procurement process, but we've been involved for all these years. We've got a project working group of numerous pension companies and administrators, and we think we're well positioned to do that, and we understand it from a technology point of view. So that's the background to who we are. You might have heard of us from our pension transfer service. We do technology integration between pension back offices and financial advisors. We have the UniPass digital ID for financial advisors. So we operate in that space. We've had four pension ministers that have seen this since Steve Webb was involved in Potfall's member. This next slide is not a political statement one way or the other as regards Brexit, but I quite like these guys. They're quite good fun. And I'm just making the simple point that numerous other countries, not just European countries, have had dashboards for a number of years. Some of them did it with compared to us, minimal fuss. The Swedes, the Danes and the Dutch were talking at a conference last year, and they gave us the benefit of their advice. They were slightly incredulous that we hadn't got round to it yet, that we were still in 4.5 years of feasibility. Why can't you just get on with it? What are the objections? Although when you dig deeper on the Swedish experience, it was hard yards. You know, they started off in a non-compulsory environment, and it's taken them 8 years to get a decent level of functionality and adoption. So we haven't even started that journey yet. So the good news is that the DWP has set the direction with respect to governance. Governance will be the responsibility of the Money and Pension Service, which was the amalgam of the Money Advice Service, TPAS, the Pensions Advisory Service, and PensionWise. That organisation is just forming now. They were called the Single Financial Guidance Body for a while. The consultation has said that state pension data has to be there. The policy intent is clear. It's to find and view citizens' pensions. They've said it will start with a single non-commercial dashboard hosted by Maps, and it will evolve in time, a timetable to be determined, into multiple commercial dashboards, such that pension companies, financial advisors, employers can define their own dashboards. And the technical architecture is also defined. Quite a lot of things still to be done. There's a lot of talk about the digital ID. Will it be a private sector version of Verify that you can use to look at your state pension entitlement and to do your tax return? There's no decisions yet on what will appear on a dashboard, but we'll touch on that briefly. Guy Opperman was very upbeat at the Horizons conference last week. He's saying he'll be down on a ton of bricks on any pension provider or administrator that is not preparing actively for this. However, the reality is that they are behind where they said they were going to be. So there were some recent DWP Maps roundtables. There were 2 of them in London. They were asking very back to basics questions, which was a bit frustrating when you've been through 4 years of feasibility. Maps has appointed a principal, Chris Curry, from the PPS. They are close to appointing an implementation director to start next month. We don't know who yet. Unfortunately, John Gavett, their CEO, departed a couple of weeks ago, and we know they are filling some key roles of subject matter experts, one on procurement, one on data standards, one on technical architecture. So while all this forming and handover between DWP and Maps is happening, there's inevitable loss of momentum. There's no news yet on the industry delivery group, so you would hope that they would be industry grandees and subject matter experts that would come from industry bodies like yourselves and from providers and administrators direct. No news yet on those appointments. They have appointed consultants. They went out to tender a few weeks ago, and they've appointed consultants to work on a business case roadmap and planning phase. This is a 12-week exercise that would take us through to September. It was supposed to start a couple of weeks ago. It's imminent. And the selection of the core components, and by core components, I'm talking about the Pension Finder service, the Digital ID Hub, the governance register, which would oversee who could play in the ecosystem in terms of dashboard providers, pension providers, etc. There's no details of any invitation to tender for that process yet, but likely to go through a full European journal process, which in itself takes quite a few months. And they have conceded that there will be no live dashboard in 2019, which is something Guy Opperman did promise us. So, are we getting clarity on the outstanding questions? Well, yes, there will be compulsion. It will be in the next pensions bill. Who will the governance body be? It'll be Maps. How will it be funded via a levy? Details to follow. Will state pension data be available? Yes. We don't know precisely when. You can get your state pension entitlement through gov.uk already. This would be slightly different iteration of that technology, so it would be DWP doing it rather than HMRC, and it would have to integrate with a dashboard architecture, which it doesn't currently. How many dashboards will there be? One public initially, and at a timetable to be determined there will be multiple. What's the architecture? A single PFS, as it's known, plus digital ID. What is the digital ID and how will it be paid for? The Verify circles talk about a level of assurance. Level of assurance 2 requires your passport and driving license and a document checking service. It's quite tough to get through that level of assurance. You also need details of your credit history. So organisations like the Post Office, Experian, provide that checking service for the public sector Verify at the moment, and 5 of them are interested in moving it into the private sector. That issue hasn't been resolved for the last 4.5 years. It's one of those. What will the dashboard display? Now, this is a good topic for this evening's debate. Whilst there's no confirmation, and until there's any confirmation, pension companies can't do the necessary preparation. They can't get their IT teams working on the application program interfaces, the APIs that would open up the back office admin systems to find and display the details. From ABI days, the suggestion, the sort of consensus at the time was start off fairly simple with what have I got and where is it, so that at least people can claim some of these £20 billion worth of lost pots. You can see on one screen what you've got in terms of DB, DC and state. And what are they worth? What are the DC pots worth? Current value, a recent valuation, all the details of what the service level agreements are and how often these details would be refreshed would be finalised by the governance body. Criterion did all the work around the data standards last time and would be well positioned to do that work going forward, but they would reach consensus quickly if they work with industry bodies like yourselves and like PASA, who have done a lot of work in the DB space. Will there be a projection or illustration of retirement income? All the consumer research that's been done by those earlier feasibility studies said that that's what consumers want. They don't relate to pension pots, they relate to what will I get in retirement each week or each month or per annum. How will it be calculated is a key question. Step forward, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Will it be a big database? That's one of these myths that some people who don't understand it don't understand. No, it won't be a big database. So for information security purposes, you don't want a single place that can be hacked. The Pension Finder service doesn't store any data. It's a conduit, it's a pipe, and it's an authorization engine that orchestrates the finds and then stores URLs or tokens in a central place that can then be checked. The data is stored with the pension company or with their integration service provider or administrator. ISP is the term for if you're not going to get your back-end system to talk directly to the PFS, you might put something in front of it, a bit like a data warehouse or a single customer view. Important question around sharing of citizens' data. Will they be able to share with a financial advisor or with a trusted helper working at Maps, as you can now over the phone with TPAS? Yes, that is there in the consultation. So this Pension Finder service has an authorization service. It works with a technical protocol called UMA, or User Managed Access, which manages all the consent. This is very GDPR compliant. There are 2 levels of consent. There's the one that fits within the DWP's policy remit, which says, I give my consent for this pension finder service to go off and find and display my pensions across the industry. And the second level of consent is, I give that consent for this data to be held or persisted at a dashboard run by Maps or a third party. Now, again, that's been the subject of a lot of debate backwards and forwards. Broader questions, how does the pension dashboard relate to open pensions? The pensions dashboard is an early iteration of open pensions. Whilst there's a policy remit around the dashboard, there isn't any regulation around open pensions. I think a good bit of advice for the pension industry, the data standards people, and this is advice from open banking, is even if the initial iteration of the dashboard is fairly simple, you should include a broader data set in the regulations, such that as the dashboard evolves to something richer in data content, you don't have to go back and change regulation, as open banking have had a number of teething issues with. So it is an early iteration of open pensions. There have been APIs around for a long time, so Orago and Criterion, as they are now, provide financial advisors with a set of data standards for looking at all the details of a contract of a pension or an ISA or another investment. So a proportion of the industry is used to the fact of opening up their admin systems to quite a rich set of data. No regulatory driver for open pensions yet. Just a few words on the difference between open pensions and open banking. Different regulatory driver. Open banking is all about opening up competition for the big 5 or 7 banks, and you have to know where your banking accounts and details are. So you go into an open banking app and you actually share your credentials with that app. So you give them your digital ID for the banks and credit card companies that you're involved in. In the world of pensions, if you've lost your pots in the first place, you're not going to be able to do that. If you've got some pots that you've never had online credentials for because they're sat there from employment from many years past, then you probably don't have online credentials. So there's a finder element to pensions dashboard that doesn't exist in the banking world. Having said that, there's lots of crossovers in the sort of roadmap to open finance, where you can see all your bits and bobs on the same app, be it banking or pensions or ISAs and etc. So just a few words on how the pension dashboard works before I hand over back to Andrew. There is at the top a dashboard. A consumer logs into that dashboard. The dashboard invokes the pension finder service. That goes off to one of these digital ID providers. And in a federated ID world, you will have a choice of which digital ID provider you choose. You may already have one for having done it with gov.uk Verify, and hopefully they're portable into the private sector. Once you've got a digital ID, there is a level of assurance that the whole ecosystem knows who you are. And given that trust, the pension finder service can then orchestrate a search across, we think, 300 plus endpoints. So think of all the DC providers in the sector, the investment platforms, the SIP specialists, the occupational providers and administrators, the in-house managed or in-house administered schemes. There is 300 plus of them out there. So it orchestrates the search, it returns a result back to the dashboard, and it stores this URL at the pension finder service. The next time a dashboard comes in, if the pension's already found, it doesn't need to go back through the PFS, it goes direct to the pension company. It will check on the way back that authorization is still valid. That's the technology in essence. It's not terribly complicated. It's not the most complicated thing between us and getting to a launch of the dashboard. Things like calculating your retirement income, sorting out the digital ID, and 300 odd pension companies opening up their admin systems to these APIs. Those are the critical path activities. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, okay, so following on from that then, why the pensions dashboard is more than a data collection exercise. What is it that needs to go on pensions dashboard to make it useful and to achieve the objectives that it has? As Michael alluded to, the very first objective that DWP have got is this find and view in terms of members being able to find their pension pots and view them. However, within their consultation response, they outlined a number of other things that dashboards could do, quote, as a minimum. And I'm not going to spend the next 10, 15 minutes beating up on DWP, but there will be a little bit of that right at the beginning. They talked about reconnecting people with their pensions, and I think Find and View does that. They've talked about trying to engage people with their pensions. Find and View can do that to an extent too. They talk about people being in control of their pensions. I don't think Find and View is going to achieve that. They talk about underpinning a sensible environment for obtaining financial advice. Again, Find and View on its own, those two statements, it's very loose and difficult to understand how that's going to help underpin the ability to obtain financial advice in a standardized environment. They talk about simplifying and understanding of decumulation strategies. Well, I think as an industry, those are still developing. So certainly Find and View isn't going to do that. Now, the Working Party, as was in 2018, put together a research paper which was published at the beginning of the year, outlining some of the difficulties around some of those things. Again, Michael spoke about individuals' desire and need to have projected benefits at retirement rather than, say, a current value or whether that's a DC pot, whether that's a deferred DB benefit, whatever it might be. That isn't enabling individuals to take control of their retirement saving because you're not actually letting them know what they're going to get in retirement, giving them any indication of what that might be. So what we'll do in this session is try and go over some of the issues that we're going to have to address, and ultimately this is the area that, from an actuarial perspective, I believe we can add most value. There's lots of the technology that Michael's talked about and the communication features, etc. that I'm sure lots of us have got an opinion on, but ultimately we're not the experts in those areas, and we need to work with the experts in those areas in the delivery group and make sure that we can contribute the most effectively from an actuarial perspective. So again, last bit of DWP bashing. These two statements were both in the forward/exec summary in their consultation response. For too long, pensions have been obscure, hard to understand and inaccessible to many. Pensions dashboards will change this. And then 2 paragraphs later, the first phase of dashboards development, no additional regulations are needed to ensure consumers using dashboards are appropriately protected. Now, I know that there is a view that the industry could have done something on this a little sooner and been a bit more proactive, but that's a pretty damning indictment of everything that's ever been provided from a pensions provider to an individual with a pension pot somewhere. And I think that's slightly unfair. I think there's for me, a misconception here that we have a regulatory environment that enables us to provide all the things that a dashboard needs to do. And I think that's something that we need to be shouting loudly as a profession. Certainly when it comes to comparability of benefits in a consistent manner, the complexities of the UK pensions environment are such that it doesn't lend itself to easily take the apples, pears, carrots, lettuces, etc., the whole grocery shop, and enable people to understand what their retirement income will look like. And again, alongside that, because of the different types of products that we've got and benefits that we've got out there, giving a clear understanding of the risks involved with those benefits to people is something else that is crucial from a dashboard perspective that we as actuaries should be able to support. In terms of that phased functionality then, I think, and Michael said the same thing here, it's really important that we've got some idea of what the long-term vision is, the multiple dashboards, so that when we put in place the framework on day one, we're not going back on a 12, 18 monthly basis to providers and saying, oh yeah, we forgot about this, and maybe you need to give us that, and maybe you need to do this calculation over here, which underpins our ability to communicate through the dashboard. So whilst it's absolutely clear we're going to need phasing of functionality, some vision of what goes in towards what could be considered the end game at the moment needs to be taken account of right up front. So in terms of the find and view piece, find pensions, collate information, introduce the dashboard to members. Let's not get carried away with ourselves, because what we don't want to do is try and boil the ocean and never actually deliver anything. And I think you talked about the Swedish experience. I know they very much built theirs piecemeal and tried to get different providers involved and target more and more people. So I think that's something that's very key. A version 2 of the dashboard functionality could be, talking more about the value of people's benefits to them. That could be through click-throughs to individual providers, current fund values, CTVs, options and guarantees being talked about, contingent benefits, fee structures, all the sorts of things that put an individual in the position whereby if they know they know what they want, they're in a position to now be able to control their own retirement saving, as opposed to that find and view, which is just the very highest level understanding of what they've got. And then perhaps beyond that, and again, how many phases is this? Whether it's still on a centralized dashboard or whether by this point we're off to the races with multiple commercial entities putting their own front end on a dashboard. Risk assessment, retirement planning, interactive toolkit, whether we actually start offering all the way through to choices about your actual savings, decumulation options, etc. And again, if that is the case, where does that line get drawn between what would be decisions that you should be making with your individual provider versus what's held on the dashboard itself? And I think there are pros and cons of lots of different options there, which perhaps we'll go into later on. But within that context, we've also got to think about some of the differences that we've got within the industry, which within the pensions environment in the UK. And I think some of this is pretty obvious stuff once you put it on paper, but I think it merits putting it down. So how do we deal with DB versus DC? I mean, the initial ABI project, which I know Orago were a part of as well, had some very basic information on it, and I think it sort of had a fund value for a DC benefit, and it had a pension amount for a DB benefit. Well, what does that mean if I don't know the difference between DB and DC? It doesn't mean anything. So how do we deal with just simple differences between the two most common types of benefits within the UK? Obviously, default decumulation for DB, there isn't for DC. Normal retirement age is an obvious feature for a DB scheme. And again, however, we do have many schemes with multiple different retirement ages within it, and that brings its own complications. Defined contribution, well, yes, we project an arbitrary sort of retirement age now. So again, how does that play in? And when you start bringing in things like state pension as well, does that bring in a third date, a fourth date, a fifth date for some people? Pension increases, one side they're predetermined, on the other side they're optional. I think ABI numbers are 2 out of every 3 pensions. No, it's 7 out of every 8 pensions are non-increasing, and 2 out of every 3 have no contingent benefits. So, is that a default that we want to use as part of projections within pensions dashboard? Whereas, does that make them comparable or sensibly comparable against DB benefits where these things are predetermined. Options and various factors that apply to individual DB benefits that are less relevant or not relevant at all in the DC space. Again, we've talked about whether or not live fund values should be used for DC benefits. Is that the right thing to do, or actually should we be looking something similar to SMPIs where you've got a fixed point and you don't see anything again for another 12 months? There, again, pros and cons of both of those options. The DB side obviously is far less sensitive to market changes, albeit there are still some secondary impacts, whether it's employer covenant or various other things that need to be considered like that. So yeah, there are huge differences just between simple DB and simple DC benefits, and translating them for the individual is not necessarily that straightforward. Won't dwell on this side again. I think I sort of talked through the issues with the various retirement ages. Do you introduce different benefits from different ages? Do you try to standardise them all, perhaps at state pension age, but then that may have little or no meaning to some people? How do you get around those issues? So, this is very, very simple example, as I'm sure you can all see, suggesting that actually graphical representation of benefits is something that would make sense to an individual so they can actually understand what's going on. This is something that in my day job, we've had some relative success with this type of approach in terms of member response and saying, actually, I do understand what it is I get now. Particularly, for example, in civil service scheme where there are people with 2, 3, sometimes 4 different retirement ages. So it may be possible to build a chart like that where you get a graphical representation of what your income would be at different ages. But, much like a lot of this, the question then comes from the individual. So what? Is that the only thing I can do? And obviously it isn't. DC pot can come into payment at a different point. Your DB benefits you can take early or late retirement. You can defer your state pension. There's all sorts of things that can affect that. So the amount of data that is required to go in just to produce a simple chart like that is huge. And then if you want to make that interpretable by an individual and give them the option to consider different retirement profiles, then clearly you're exponentially adding to the required data. And I'm not going to stand here and suggest that that's what we should be putting on a dashboard. I'm just saying that if we're not careful, then we will get ourselves down a dark alleyway which there's no way out of, and we'll have a product out there that isn't actually helping individuals plan for their retirement. In terms of projections, who sets the assumptions for them? And I think that's a really interesting one. And we'll come on to a really simple example of the automatic responses, and it was my automatic response when I first started thinking about this. Well, I don't know how long ago that was, but it feels like a long time. Was we should use SMPIs, and it doesn't seem unreasonable, but actually there are flaws and inconsistencies that brings that will potentially drive negative behaviours if that's what we use to underpin the information on the dashboard. So we could have provider set assumptions, and I think that's certainly something that's achievable, although, as I say, probably requires some form of tighter regulation around it than we've got at the moment. Similar to the SMPI approach, it can be consistent with a redefined SMPI, etc. And again, consistency with other pensions communications is going to be an interesting one, particularly as the dashboard takes off. I mean, ultimately, I would think if we get it right within the next decade, benefit statements become a thing of the past because they're not adding value if people have got access digitally. It may well be that some people prefer benefit statements and they can actively opt in to get paper copies, etc. But ultimately, digital access will probably be the sort of way of the future. But building on the SMPI approach, it can capture the variety, complexity of different asset strategies, lifestyling, expenses, and all the rest of it, which, in terms of from an industry perspective, different products do have different profiles, and that's absolutely legitimate. So there is definitely an argument for being able to include that, and to cope with scheme-specific features within different products as well. This does, however, require that the providers do those projections. Now, whether or not we're using, annual figures or figures at a single point in time each year to populate a dashboard versus whether we're getting live figures when an individual logs in, means that actually a provider might do the same as they do today and hold data on a system, or you could be looking at having to provide live calculations on a minute-by-minute basis. Now, those are the two extremes. Perhaps it's somewhere in between, but it does mean that if we're using provider set projections or assumptions for projections, then it becomes a more difficult proposition from a provider perspective. And again, if we do that, does it drive the wrong behaviour from providers? And what flexibility do we allow such that does it drive an expected return competition? And that can't be good for anyone. The alternative is this dashboard set assumptions, which reduces the work. It does exactly the opposite, same expected returns for similar assets. However, we don't get to take account of the complexities and vagaries of different products. So it may be considered that that's less accurate, although accuracy here may be the enemy of actually getting something that's understandable to the individual. So that's something to be considered. And again, that would definitely lead to inconsistency with SMPIs as they stand at the moment. But I'm suggesting quite strongly that we need to consider whether or not those are appropriate in a dashboard-led world, or even just a world with a dashboard. And again, really simple example of current SMPIs. I know that there are different views on this, and it does depend on the information that is given to individual providers, but there are definitely providers doing each of these three, or providing information on each of these three scenarios. If we take a 25-year-old earning £25,000 a year, estimated to retire at state pension age, contributing 10% of salary, well, there are certainly projections out there where that 10% of a 25,000 salary is £2,500 a year from now until 68. There are other ones where it's linked with inflation, and others where it's linked to some form of earnings assumption. Now, those numbers don't tie up, and again, we're back to race to the top, race to the bottom, in terms of if you were considering taking information from a dashboard and consolidating or whatever it might be, you say, wait a minute, I've got these two things that are supposed to be broadly the same, and one's telling me I'm getting twice as much at the end. That can't be right. So, there's definitely something we need to do there. Just a few more thoughts before we sort of open up to the floor. Different risk profiles. I think this is a really interesting one in terms of how we communicate about some of these things to individuals. And I know that there's work going on in lots of places in some of these spaces and not in others, but the actual way to translate it into something that means that's relevant to the individual, it's tough to do. If we look at investment risk, longevity risk, inflation, covenant, data, personal health, these are all more or less relevant to different people and different products. And there's no clear way to compare one product to another at the moment in a lot of these areas. Certainly no way that makes sense to the individual. I think really simple suggestion is try to develop something similar to the energy efficiency or car emissions or whatever it might be. These little tables that say, yeah, this is risk rating A, B, C, D, and this is what that means. So that's certainly, be some simple form of expressing this to individuals, whereby they can almost sort of see traffic light style or rainbow style, where the benefits and the funds that they've got stack up. And again, just thinking about some of the complexities we've got in the UK that some of the countries that have a dashboard already haven't really had to face. Some of the guarantees and options that we've got here are pretty difficult to deal with. Guaranteed annuity rates, scheme-specific lump sum protection, individual protections, whether that's pension age, LTA, etc. We've got different factors for different schemes. CDC might come along. There's all sorts of complexities right across the board. And how do we make sure that, again, back to the grocery shop, how do we make sure that the person isn't ending up, that the individual isn't ending up with, a parsnip when they wanted a pear? So what happens next, other than hopefully stimulating debate for the next 45 minutes or so? Industry delivery group, which Michael alluded to. I think, it's really important from my perspective, and certainly when, I had some input to and helped support, the consultation response from the IFOA on this. I think it's really important that we're banging the drum that there is a need for regulatory change to support pensions dashboard, and that if we don't, then we risk getting things wrong from an individual perspective. This consistency across different benefits and across different types of pension communications is key to the success of the dashboard. And if we're not clear about future functionality and where it might take us, then we might not have the building blocks to deliver the things that we need to. So, my personal view is that we need to be quite vocal about it. Certainly I'm trying to be in the various roundtables and working groups that I'm involved in. And hopefully that will be heard and will be well represented across those, and make sure that the dashboard is the success that it should be, because as difficult as it is, I do believe it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to engage people with the concept of retirement savings. But if we get it wrong, then it will be another generation before we get another opportunity, because it's, as we all know, trust in financial services sector is hard to build and easy to destroy. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that I had planned to cover to sort of provoke some debate. Does anybody have anything that they would like to add or discuss around dashboard? Don't all rush at once. I think we've got microphones. I think you're probably just about central in a row that you don't have to go to either side to press the button and figure out how to operate the side microphones. Sorry, I should just say we need to make sure that anybody who does have anything to say, you have to state your name for posterity. Okay,
posterity, are you listening? It's John Taylor. Thanks for a very stimulating presentation. The one thing I'd maybe like to hear a little more about is if there's any vision in terms of what change in customer behaviour or experience you're seeking to elicit. Do we want people to be engaging more, saving more, maybe changing their pots amongst to those with the lowest charges? Because I'm also mindful there are a number of potential pitfalls here. So, for example, will people be attracted with a large DB transfer more so than the income it's going to provide? And indeed, I think there's been research in the United States that if people engage too frequently with their savings, they become risk averse because they see the fluctuations and move into recklessly conservative assets. So just keen, what do we think is good customer behaviour we're trying to encourage, and what are we trying to pitfalls to avoid? Thank you.
Do you want to take that first, Michael? Or
Can I have a go at that one? Yes. Very good question. So I think there's a general level of excitement that the dashboard will be engaging for members, citizens to see all their pensions in one place. Consumer research has revealed a number of reactions. So some people will be scared by how little they are saving and how poor they might be in retirement. That's a very common reaction. Some people may be tempted to encash money, all the rest of it. just seeing what have I got and where is it begs further questions. You know, should I save more? Should I consolidate? The Australians have transfer buttons on their dashboard and they can consolidate straight away. From a technology point of view, you can see a number of joined up journeys. You could go from a dashboard to a consolidation journey, which may require opening an account with a SIP provider, or if you're moving into retirement, you can see all these things kind of joined up. I think that's getting ahead of ourselves, and I think we've got a number of years of just making the dashboard a success. There will be an implementation phasing, a bit like auto-enrollment. It'll take 3 or 4 years to happen. A lot of consumer journeys in the early years will be frustrating because they'll only see 1 or 2 of their pension pots when they're maybe expecting to see 5 or 6. So I think it's a fantastic thing to do. Another scenario is the stock market's going down and it's showing you this expected retirement income going down as you're sort of pressing the button on your app, and it's making you think, my God, I've got to work another year, or oh no, it's gone down again, I've got to work another 2 years. You know, all sorts of real-time engagement like that could be very powerful, positive and negative.
I think from my perspective, there's a couple of things. I mean, different stakeholders are going to have different objectives. And, you know, I alluded to some of the DWP stated aims as a minimum of a successful dashboard. And I think there's one that's missing, which clearly is going to be an objective of government, which is individuals save more for retirement, but not so much that the tax revenue falls. So there's a balance there. From a provider perspective, I think, you know, if you put yourself in a good space, then a consolidation button would be lovely. I'm sure lots of people would like to see that as an opportunity, but it can't be an opportunity for everyone. Certainly, negative behaviours like taking, you know, DB transfers. You know, speaking to people in LGPS, I know they're absolutely petrified about that as a potential problem. So, you know, that's definitely something that we want to avoid. I think one of the main arguments for not having real-time fund values is the constant decision making and the potential negative impacts on that. So I do think there's a strong argument not to have real-time fund values, but what is the right time period? And it's about getting that balance right. So what's positive behaviour? I think to me, it's going back to that point of individuals engaging with the concept of retirement saving, getting them to trust the fact that these numbers make sense and that it's something tangible. I was at an event last week where we were talking about trust in the financial services industry, and I said I think part of it is not so much the actions and bad experiences of individuals in the industry, it's the concept of what it is that we're trying to get people to do, which is give a predetermined amount of money to someone that they don't know for an undetermined amount of time to do something that they don't understand, at the end of which they may or may not get some money back which they might not need. That's what we're asking people to do when it comes to saving into a DC pension. Now, we all know that isn't true, but, you know, when you put it like that, that's how it feels to some people. So something that they can actually see and touch in front of them, if we can add, you know, one of the things I think that will be massively valuable to people would be an understanding of what it is that their investment is doing. You know, what is it? You know, is it an infrastructure project over here? You know, is it something that ESG can play a huge part in engaging people with pensions alongside you know, a toolkit that the dashboard can deliver, and I think that's the first step to good behaviour, is engaging people with the concept that retirement saving is good. Where we go from there, I think, is up to us as an industry at that point. Anyone else? Gentleman there.
It's Craig Smith. Partly linking to what you were just saying, I was just wondering, I suppose, what part of society are the DWP actually targeting here? Because I expect there's probably 80% plus of the population who'll never even look at this. And I suppose it's possibly those people who are most in need of seeing the results of this. And also in terms of other countries that have done this, have they seen any change in behaviour of consumers of this information, or are they still in the sort of early learning stages to see where this actually goes in the long term?
Thanks, Craig. I don't know, Michael, if you've got anything on that, or...
I could say a few words about the policy intent. So it's designed to have universal application, so every pension company will be compelled to provide the data. You can imagine that high net worth individuals who can afford financial advice tend to have consolidated into SIP type arrangements. The rest of the population will benefit from this. Another sector of the population that will benefit are those that have lost touch with their pension pots. So the ABI put a figure of 20 billion on the amount of lost pension pots. The sooner we get this pension finder service actually doing some finding, the sooner some of those older people in society will be reunited with pension pots. That's got to be a great social purpose. In terms of what have other European countries seen in terms of consumer behaviour, I know there's been a lot of research. I couldn't comment on specific findings.
Yeah, I think on that one, there is evidence in some countries that saving has increased. I think Israel's dashboard is very much a commercially focused one, and that has led to a lot more moving between providers. I know that. But yeah, in terms of solid end numbers, I'd need to go and have a look at things. I think in terms of the demographic who will benefit from this most, I think that depends on how it's designed, how it's marketed. I think back to the previous question as well, the sort of behavioural economic side of the design of this is really crucial, and the marketing of it. And if we want people to engage with it, we have to make it talk to them, and that might mean a different thing to a 20-year-old, to a 50-year-old, to a 75-year-old. In fact, it almost certainly does. So I think really it's not so much who are we targeting it at, as to how do we enable it to become that universal tool. And I think we need to really think hard about how we do that. I mean, digital coverage these days is across certainly the pre-retirement population. It's the market's almost saturated. So you're into even in the 60 plus age bracket pre-retirement, you're in well above 90% digital penetration. So people have the skills and the tools to engage with a digital product like the dashboard, but it's what does it say to them when they get there? Because what's important to a 20-year-old isn't important to a 60-year-old, and vice versa. So again, that sort of plays into the how do we work collectively with a broad skill set to make sure that the dashboard delivers the right thing? Because I suspect that's something that our profession can contribute to, but probably shouldn't drive. Gentleman here.
Thank you, Alan Watson. I was going to ask about what's the working party's thoughts on how we sort of communicate the risks of DB pensions, and that you might not get exactly what it says and you could end up in the PPF?
Yeah, I mean, simply on that one, back to the very crude proposal, I call it a proposal, it's not really a proposal, crude illustration of how we might demonstrate risk. Covenant risk is definitely something that is important in the DB space. So some form of standardized assessment of that is going to have to be a part of assessing DB benefits, because if I'm an individual and I'm taking appropriate action with my benefits, that's information that I can get hold of, that I can then help influence my decision making with. The question it leads you to, I think, there is, at what point does it become scaremongering? And I think that there's definitely something around that bit that I mentioned at the beginning, of making sure that the information's there in a complete but standardized format to support taking proper regulated financial advice. It may even be, robo-advice is a bad word, or combination of words in certain places, and I'm not saying I'm an advocate of it. I'm not saying I'm not. I think that something like the dashboard can provide a standardized data set to then do something like that with. And that may well be, well, that has to include, covenant of sponsoring employers and risk of PPF and what that then might mean. And again, if you think about the information we're talking about here, that sort of thing is not level one. We're 3, 4, 5 layers through the onion by the time we're talking about that sort of thing. And to the question up there, the majority won't be interested in digging that deep. But if we don't give them level 1 information, they'll never get to level 5. And if we don't give them level 1 information, they'll not be engaged at all. So it has to be there. It has to be included in that risk assessment for sure. How you do it, I don't have the answers yet. That's where we are, I think, and we need to work that through. You may be able to use, oh, here we go, no. I thought someone was going to get to see if we can make the button work.
John Bielski. Two comments. One would be, in terms of a comparison between DB and DC, are you including in the dashboard the transfer value? At least you would then have the current value, you'd have a comparable, although that might not be what consumers are actually interested in. And that might be something that at least gets you to level 1. And the other big question was about pension product assets. A lot of people talk about property as being their pension. They talk about ISAs. They've just got savings. Without even being able to see that or input that, is it really a pension dashboard at all for a lot of people?
Yeah, well, I think the question there is it a retirement dashboard? I think it is that question, isn't it? So, if we take the first question and look at whether or not CETVs from a DB space versus a fund value is the right way to go, I think if I was to present them to, say, my father-in-law, who's a smart guy, who's just coming up to retirement, and said, there's your DB benefit transfer value from all your years over here, and here's your DC pot for your last 10 years over here. He's going to go, so what? Yes, he needs to be able to access that information. I absolutely agree. I think that's probably after he needs to be able to see what it is he's likely to get if he leaves it where he is. And the reason I would say that is because those will look like gargantuan sums of money to a lot of people. Sums of money that the only time they've ever talked about sums of money in that spectrum will be when they've bought a house. And that's if they even have bought a house. So transfer, I'm absolutely committed from a philosophical point of view to giving people information about the benefits they have and the options they have around them, because I think that's absolutely crucial. But we've got to think from a behavioural perspective what's right for the individual. And for me, I'm really clear that is benefits first, and that fund values and CETVs is definitely it's a layer down, and it probably has to go along with a degree of description and caveat that you don't want on page one of something that may disengage. So that would be my answer to that one. And in terms of it being a retirement planning tool, I think if I go back to the multiple dashboards option at the end, where commercial entities have their own front end on things, etc., then I absolutely agree with you. That needs to be a key input. Now, I wouldn't see that as something you'd put on a centralized tool. If you were, say, an IFA trying to use this information for, log in here to our version of the dashboard and we can help deliver you some robo-advice or whatever else it might be, then yes, you're going to need to have that ability to input that, because that's such a huge proportion of some individuals' retirement saving. And I think that's why this tool in the dashboard is so crucial, because people do invest their retirement savings in cash, let alone things like property, because they can touch it, feel it, they trust it, they know what it is. They don't understand what their pension is a lot of the time. And whilst education isn't the only solution to that, I think the dashboard can do it promotes awareness, it promotes a closeness to your benefits. You can see them, you can touch them on a daily basis like you can your current account. And if we don't get ourselves into a position where we're around about the same level as other industries, people will just put their money elsewhere, because they don't understand the benefits of saving within a pension. Ultimately, long term, I can see a scenario down the track where open banking and open pensions and open tax returns and all the rest of it talk to each other. And if you want to move money from one account to another and into your DC fund and you want tax rebate and then actually know you need it back at some point, that's possible. Technologically, that's possible. So if you want to engage people with the concept of retirement saving, make it easy. So yeah, I would say that we've got to include those things, but probably not at the beginning. I don't know if you've got anything more on that, Michael.
Just a quick word about expanding beyond pensions. So that there are already apps out there where you can see all your money behind. So you can see your savings and investments, your pensions, your loans and mortgages. Behind the scenes, there's not a lot of pension company connectivity. In practice, consumers can go to those apps and say, here are my details. That would involve a point-to-point connection. In a lot of cases, there's just a letter of authority going on behind the scenes. So the advantage of a pension finder service and a dashboard is it's there in regulation. So the pension companies have to make the investment to connect to it. If it's an investment platform and it's advised, do those platforms want to make those client details available to D2C apps? That is a very that whole landscape is at fairly early stage, I would say. Having said that, open banking is making inroads. Dashboard will be the first iteration of open pensions, and TISA, for example, have an initiative called Open Savings and Investments, which historically they're the ISA trade organisation. Whether these things all merge into open finance at some point in the future, I'm sure that's a journey, but I think it's aspirational long term at this stage.
Any more?
Kate Stewart-Roper. I agree it's benefits that's what's important to people, but how do you illustrate defined contribution benefits in a pension freedoms world? And when you start doing that, how do you get people's personal longevity risks into the pensions dashboard?
I'm hoping that you're all going to help me answer that. Those are the difficult questions that we've got, and that's the reason why when I've stood in front of other audiences in different places, people have said this is unachievable. How do you do those things? well, your assumption setting has to be based around something. It probably has to start with something that's standardized. There is the argument I suggested earlier, which is, should we let accurate, 100% accurate get in the way of actually delivering something usable? And I think there's a balance. There is a balance there. Again, I suggest that some of the things that you're talking about probably come in at later stages in the commercial offerings, whereby you're actually getting value add from interacting with an organization who's doing something specifically for you, rather than getting something from a generic dashboard. But that generic centralized dashboard has to be a starting point to get there, and I think that's the difficulty we've got. How do you translate DC into something meaningful? I mean, decumulation to me is it's bigger than all, because if you talk about drawdown, what does drawdown mean? What does the profile of it look like for any one individual based on their circumstances? Annuities largely will become a thing of the past if we move to a world where the decumulation market is a bit more mature and has a lot more options in it, I think. But what does that look like? When does that happen? How do we don't have answers to those. That's why this is really hard. And that's why when we talk about, does the regulatory environment exist to give something meaningful to an individual on a dashboard? I don't think it does. And that's why I think the actuarial profession needs to be really well represented when we're discussing these things. I know that's not really an answer to your question other than it's hard, but yeah, it's hard.
Candia Kingston, can you talk a little bit about the move from a generic dashboard to a commercial dashboard or multiple commercial dashboards? Who would fund them? Are they by subscriber? What's other countries' experiences of them? You talked about the fact that the dashboard would be paid for by a levy. So how does that then translate into a commercial model?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one in terms of the levy that will pay for the dashboard. Ultimately, wherever that comes from, it's money coming out of, it's going to come out of the saver's pocket ultimately. So that is that's a really interesting sort of dilemma, I guess. In terms of how do we get from centralized single dashboard to multiple commercial dashboards, I think that's a really hard journey for people to take. I don't know how quickly that'll happen. I don't know, Michael, you might have a view on that. I think it's going to be up to individual commercial entities to decide whether or not there's actually benefit of doing it. I mean, I flippantly mentioned that a consolidator button might feel like a really good value add from an individual provider perspective. Well, it is if people are using their consolidator button rather than someone else's. And I think you sort of alluded to that being something that has led to action in Australia. So I think that the answer on that is it's hard to know how quickly and how realistic it is for individuals to for organisations to think about a commercial dashboard and what that offering will entail. I've got some ideas around what you could do in terms of pension smart meter, pension sat nav. Where are you? Where do you want to go? How do you get there? Answering some of those types of questions. But what does that look like long term? Yeah. Again, it's answers on a postcard. I think we have to make sure we get the first few stages right before we then carry on and into whatever the commercial dashboard landscape looks like.
Yes, just a few comments on that. So when the Treasury were running the ABI project, the Treasury were very keen on fintech innovation. and competition. So they wanted to see lots of dashboards from the outset. The DWP, again, this is one of these debates that goes backwards and forwards. The DWP have gone back to where the money advice service were sort of 3 or 4 years ago, and let's start with a single dashboard. It'll be easier to control, it'll be safer for the consumer and data protection, and let's worry about innovation and competition at a later stage. So I think most other countries have gone for just single state-backed dashboards at this stage. Lots of people in the industry would like to see, if they're acquisitive in terms of assets, they want to have their own dashboard and they want to differentiate themselves and do creative things. There are lots of fintech companies who want to take a dashboard and plug them into modelling tools of retirement income and cash flow and risk management and all those good things. And why not? Why not open the door to that innovation further down the track? So those are the sort of debates that are going on. If you want to enter the sector as a dashboard provider, and you will gain from it, as opposed to a pension administrator who will not be providing a dashboard and just has the IT cost of complying with the regulation, then those dashboard providers should probably pay to play in the ecosystem. That's the thinking. Just one other thought on the cost of advice. So there has been speculation that a lot of the groundwork that financial advisors have to do at the moment is the basic legwork of finding a client's dashboard, finding their pension pots before they can offer any advice. And that could be at least a third of the effort. So if the advisor can get delegated access to a citizen's dashboard, then a lot of the cost of the initial fact-finding has been taken out of the advice process, and hopefully that would get passed on to clients.
Any more thoughts or questions? I feel like we might be drying up. One more, John? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi. John Taylor again. If I could maybe reflect on the pensions freedom question, because we've certainly done a fair amount of modelling looking at the differences between the kind of income yield you might get from a sensible-ish drawdown plan at a reasonable level of sustainability versus an annuity. And for someone in the mid-60s, there's not a huge difference actually in the kind of income you might get. So to your point, Andrew, I would suggest that you can give a level 1 sense of benefits. It might be the level of 3.5%, that sort of ballpark, that would be meaningful without having yet to get into the annuity versus drawdown consideration. That's maybe a level 2, level 3 consideration. So that was the kind of point I wanted to make on the dashboard. I've just got one shameless plug though to make before I finish, and that there's another event in the Scottish community later on this week. So we've got the AGM and presidential address on Wednesday night. It's the first time the AGM for the merged Institute and Faculty of Actuaries is taking place outside of outside of London. And the first presidential address in Edinburgh since the last days of the faculty. So it's quite an unusual event. If that isn't enough of a lure, there's CPD available in the last few days of the CPD year. And I'm hoping the presidential address is going to be something to listen to, but it will contain not 1, but 2 unprecedented announcements. So get along. And finally, and probably most compellingly, there's free alcohol on offer. So thank you.
Well, on that, I guess, unless anybody else has got a last... Oh, we do have one more, have we? Good.
I'll not let John Taylor get 2 questions in and I don't get 2 points in. Alan Watson again. I'll offer you the opportunity. What's the working party? Is the working party going to continue?
Yes.
Because I think you've got it to that layer one. We want, and I think we might be looking for some volunteers in here because they've all got great ideas. We really need, I think, this working party to continue, and you need to start delving into the levels 2, 3, 4, 5 to actually try and explain some of these things. So do you want to maybe sort of outline some of what you'd like to do with the working party, and hopefully some of these gallant people here will decide they want to volunteer and help you?
Well, yes, and thank you for making that plug before I was able to make it myself. That is exactly what I was going to close with. If anybody is interested, then please get in touch. Hijack me before I leave the building, whatever it takes, because there's a huge amount to be done here, and I think that's absolutely right. I think our first, and Catherine, you'll back me up here, our first difficulty is actually getting this discussion on the table with certain people. So at the round tables that Michael alluded to during his opening, I was banging the table, literally banging the table, talking about this, and you get a mixture of blank and quizzical looks from around the room from a lot of people. You know, there's probably 20% of the people in that room who understand that actually there's a problem here that needs addressed. So, you know, the first thing is for people in the profession and around about it to really make noise about the fact that we need to get this right. And then beyond that, I think the working party absolutely does need to carry on. It needs to be involved in that industry delivery group. It needs to be coming up with a framework of comparability for all of these different complexities. And you know, that starts with the really simple things like, how do we deal with different retirement ages? How do we deal with DB versus DC at the very highest level? And as we go through that sort of evolution of dashboard functionality, there's ever more, as we've seen tonight, there's ever more questions that we need to answer. So to get to the bottom of that and to do it properly, you know, at the moment our working party is 5. You know, we've got lots of support from the IFOA policy team as well, and we're supporting each other mutually on this. But that isn't going to cut it. We need more people with this type of ability to break down the problem and solve it before this will work. It is hard. It's not impossible, but it is very hard. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And as I say, if anybody is interested in joining the working party, then please give me a shout, because every time I speak to anyone about this, I do say that. And you know, occasionally I get volunteers, but it's not that often. So yeah, please do.
Just to support that, Andrew, it would be brilliant if the actuarial profession could step in and give us some firm and early advice on how expected retirement income could be calculated for the first iteration of the dashboard, which is maybe not this year, but live, but it will be beta this year. And technologists and administrators and civil servants aren't going to make those decisions. We need the actuarial profession just to tell the rest of the organisation what to do.
Okay. I guess unless there is anybody else, no, I think that's probably, we've reached the natural conclusion of the conversation. I mean, I'm personally very grateful for anyone who spend any time talking about this, because, you know, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm quite passionate about it. I do believe that this is something that's very important, but if we get it wrong, it's only going to set us back as an industry. And it's one of those that it's quite easy to dismiss it as a data gathering or an administration exercise combined with the technology that needs to underpin it, but it's absolutely not. So if there is, as I say, anybody who wants to come and talk to me about supporting it, I would absolutely love to hear from them. Or if anybody's got any brilliant ideas on how we can make sure that DWP are listening, I'll take those as well. That's definitely, Maps. It won't be DWP. Make sure that Maps are listening. Again, I keep harassing them on LinkedIn, but to no avail as yet. it definitely is. It definitely is something that's going to be a big talking point in the industry in the next few years. So I really want to make sure we get it right. And working with companies like Orago to deliver a successful dashboard will be a real feather in the cap if we get it right. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to Michael for his support and for that of Orago tonight. And thank you to you all for coming along and putting forward your questions and thoughts and helping with the debate. Thank you very much.